Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on when you see this. This is Ken Weber, Weber Asset Management's president. I'm here in New York, and my partner and chief investment strategist, Jack Bowers, is on the road in a road trip. Jack, tell everybody where you are at the moment.
Toledo, Ohio. I got the new Plaid Model X, and I'm putting it to the test. I should be back home in about 3 or 4 days. So,
for those of you who don't know, I have a Tesla Model X as well, but not the Plaid version. The Plaid version is like a rocket ship on wheels.
Yeah.
It's slightly dangerous.
They made it 600 pounds lighter too. Yeah,
yeah, it's an astonishing car, and I got to drive it for a few minutes when Jack was here in New York, and we had a meeting up in Boston, so I got to experience the power of Plaid. And then there was an incident with coffee spilling because of the power, but we won't go into that right now.
It's ridiculous. He put 22 speakers and 975 watts of power, so even the audio system can simulate live concert volume.
Right. Well, let's get right to what our clients and prospective clients are curious about. I have several topics to talk about as usual. Jack, let's talk about the big one on everybody's mind, I think, inflation. Now, there's some good news with inflation. Just this morning, there was news that chip availability, computer chip availability, which had been sparse and tightened because of supply chain issues, it appears that that is loosening up much quicker than people had expected, and that's very good news. Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Yes. Yeah, I think, you know, the chip makers have been trying to expand capacity everywhere they can, and in some cases, a lot of companies doubled or tripled orders. And so it looked like there was an enormous shortage when in fact, I think there was just a little slight shortage. And now that we're starting, some of the companies are starting to get about ahead of the curve, a lot of those duplicate orders are going away. So it may be one of those things where it resolves very, very quickly, most likely, you know, before the end of this year, and maybe much sooner, like we're starting to see evidence of now. We're also getting relief in the oil prices too, not from an unexpected place. China is so far, with the exception of Shanghai, which is loosening the rules a little bit for factories there. China is sticking to its zero COVID policy, and it could imply lockdowns and limited mobile ability for a large share of the population. And so oil prices are tumbling today on that news after coming down somewhat last week. Yeah. So that'll at least address some of the direct causes of inflation. But if China's supply chain really melts down, we could be in a situation where there's other inflationary pressures coming from other places. But the chip shortage news is good because it could bring down used car prices very quickly. And that has been a significant component of the inflation figures that we've been seeing so far.
That's true. That's true. And just to remind people who are worried about or are concerned about inflation, which is definitely an issue, it's a global problem, and much of it starts in China, where the factories don't have workers because of COVID or because they're locked out. At the ports, there's lots of pictures of 500 container ships out in the harbor in China waiting to load up, and they can't get workers and they can't get trucks. It's the same issues we have here receiving the stuff. So it's an issue that's facing the entire world. But as you're saying, there's starting to show cracks in the wall, and the inflation, the supply chain issue, which exacerbates inflation, seems to be ameliorating just a bit currently.
Yes, and I think in the U.S., one of the big components was wage inflation too. And you know, this road trip has shown that even the hotels now are getting by pretty well. So it has to be that enough people have been coming to work in the last few months that even the tourism and travel industry is starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel here. So that may signal that we're done with kind of the not enough to go around problem, but we will probably still see you know, wages going up for the simple reason that you know, cost of living is going up. And I think that's where the Fed is really kind of trying to get ahead of the curve. They don't want to end up with a situation like the 70s in hand, and so they're being a little more aggressive on the front end.
The other issue that we can't ignore is the Ukrainian situation, war. It has everybody around the world spooked. It's hard to tease out which part of the Ukrainian war affects the US stock market. There's many different factors, but maybe you just want to briefly tell us your thoughts on how the war is affecting what we do here with mutual funds.
Gosh, I think the main economic effect would be the high price for natural gas and the high price for oil, because there's a very concerted effort to stop using Russian products, and I think in some ways of looking at it, this will accelerate the drive towards zero carbon. So in a long-term sense, this could be a good thing, but in a short-term sense, it's really a tough thing to solve quickly. The zero COVID policy is helping bring some relief, which buys a few months to try and get some things going that may not have been there before. But we are probably looking at, elevated energy prices for the better part of a year or so. And I think things will probably come quickly back down to normal after that. But we may have already reached the point where inflation is topped out, at least the CPI. We'll know, later this month.
Consumer price index.
Yeah, consumer price index. I know we're probably going to have a wage inflation problem for a while, but the productivity of companies is jumping. And so I think, a lot of that will be offset by improved productivity. And you can tolerate, 4 or 5% wage inflation as long as your productivity is in the 3 to 4% range. And I think we're rapidly going to get there for the companies that have a labor problem. Bond investors, importantly, don't really see inflation any worse than about 3% over the next 10 years, which
I'm sure that comes as a surprise to many people who all they see is the 8% per year, year over year numbers. So to hear you say that the bond market is expecting nothing like 8%, forever, I think that's reassuring.
Yeah. So if you figure 3% for the next 10 years, that kind of suggests that we're going to see some pretty rapid relief just between now and the end of the year if the bond market is right. But the bond market looks at real long-term forces. It doesn't look at short-term forces. And clearly the zero COVID policy, which is actually making China's real estate bust worse more quickly. Once the real estate bust is full-fledged in China, it's going to put, downward pressure on a lot of metals. So you can see a scenario where, a lot of the inflation relief comes out of China. So that pretty much could take care of everything except wage inflation. And if we've got higher productivity to boot, you can see, inflation coming down to a normal level fairly quickly. Now that hasn't, pacified stock investors who seem almost more worried about inflation than bond investors. But what stock investors are really fearing right now is the Fed, because one of the Fed officials came out and, up till now, they've been trying to get to kind of what they call neutrality, a point where they're neither, accelerating the economy or reining it in. They're just kind of getting to a point where rates aren't artificially low. And that the assumption was the Fed was going to try and get to neutrality as quickly as possible and then kind of survey the landscape and decide what to do next. But now at least one official is talking about kind of a 70s style posture, late 70s posture, where they actually try and put the brakes on. And that's what's behind this 0.5 point increase that Powell basically all but acknowledged.
Excuse me, but that leads to the question that I'm sure is on many people's minds, because if they watch any sort of financial programming, they see the R word. Recession is looming out there. Some people are certain that it's coming.
Yes.
You and I think, have a slightly different view. Sorry?
Mm-hmm. The yield curve is flat now, very flat. So, and that does increase the probability of a recession. I think we're kind of in a different realm right now, because consumers are not, fueling their spending habits with debt at this point. They're doing it with savings. And so to some degree, they don't need to borrow. And so a flat yield curve, which usually implies banks are pulling back on lending, and that's what usually, slows the economy. I don't think a pullback on lending is going to slow things as much, because a lot of what the spending that's going on right now is not being done based on borrowing. So we may be in a situation where, it's flat yield curve, but we never see GDP go negative this time.
I didn't hear the answer though. What are your odds that we're actually going to hit an official recession?
I
I hate to pin you down.
30%, I
30%.
think the official odds.
I'm sorry, did you say 30%?
Mathematically calculated are not much higher than that.
Did you say 30%, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Wow. So I'm glad to hear you say that. I think it's a little higher, actually.
Yeah, and I think all stock investors do. You look at the way people are reining in growth stocks and reining in bonds, you can see a scenario where people think it's really ugly. I think a lot of what's happening right now is people just running for cover. I don't think any of this is driven on earnings, and I don't think any of this is driven on inflation fears. It's just people haven't faced a situation like this before, and they don't know what to make of it, and they're going to cash.
Yeah, and speaking of earnings, a lot of earnings numbers are going to be coming out just in the next few days, this week, actually. So
Yeah.
maybe we should have waited till Friday to do this, but
Yeah.
you never
I
know.
think earnings will be good. There shouldn't be any overwhelming. I mean, there's always positives and negatives, but
Yeah.
I think in aggregate, the trend here has been that, earnings are holding up better than everybody would have expected in a high inflation environment. And I think that will continue to be the case.
Right. So so my odds of recession are 50%, yours are 30%. If it does happen and we start slipping into a real slowdown in the US economy, how is that going to be reflected in how you're structuring the Weber asset portfolios?
Well, value stocks are holding up much better than growth stocks in this environment because the biggest fear is what the Fed will do. And when the Fed takes interest rates up to a point where it's actually breaking the economy, that kind of implies, something where 3 or 4% might be a normal situation. And that substantially reduces the value of future earnings, which of course is why growth stocks are getting hit so hard. But I don't think a recession this time around would have a really damaging impact. It would mainly affect consumer spending. And if I were to guess, it would be a very shallow and short-lived recession.
Well, there you and I agree.
Yeah.
You and I agree because I think, as I say, I'm expecting a little bit more than you are, but I do want to say that if we do slip into an officially declared recession based on certain benchmarks, I think it'll be shallow, just the shallowest type of recession, and over pretty quickly. So it sounds like that's.
I can even see a scenario where, anytime the economy slows, it shifts people more toward growth stocks because those are the companies that continue to grow earnings, and flat yield curves tend to do that anyway. So while it doesn't appear to be a great time to be doing it, I am kind of trying to step out on a limb a little bit more, get a little, not in the lower risk accounts, but at least in the select model and maybe some other places soon, get a little bit more into large cap growth again. Because if the economy does slow down, that may turn out to be the place to be.
Right. Great. Well, Jack, we've covered a lot of ground. You have a lot of miles, speaking of covering ground, ahead of you driving back to Nevada. So we'll let you go.
Okay.
And thank you for stopping in Toledo for us. And
no problem at all.
all right, everybody. And thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.